How did the colony of Jamestown, a struggling outpost with a few English settlers laboring to survive, turn into a booming agricultural society of the Tidewater region built on the growth of tobacco grown off the backs of slaves? The answer can be found in 1619. Jamestown was the first established English settlement in North America and had been struggling to get off the ground for 4 years when John Rolfe and his crewmates showed up in 1610 with some smuggled tobacco, and the boom was on. Up until the settlement of Jamestown, the global tobacco market had been controlled by the Spanish. Europe was hooked on the stuff. By 1617, tobacco exports to England totaled 20,000 pounds. The next year, 40,000 pounds. By 1630, 1.5 million pounds were exported out of the region every year. How did this happen? Planting and cultivating the plant is rather labor intensive. One has to prepare the seedbed, rake it, take care of it, pull weeds. Once the plant grows up a bit, it then must be transplanted to the main field. Then tobacco needs to be harvested, packed for shipping. Another issue with tobacco, as the planters of the time of the Revolution found out, is that tobacco ruins the soil, and the best tobacco grows best on newly cleared fields. Well, that takes a lot of people to clear those fields. That is an incentive for tobacco planters to add a larger labor force right there, something which the English were in no short supply. Laborers had been crowding London streets for years. Many were jumping at the chance to work in the New World. Combine that with the chance at free passage and the possibility of gaining your own plot of land after a number of years, white English men and or women, mostly men, would indenture themselves or sign themselves over to a landowner in the Tidewater for a number of years, with the promise of free land, often 50 acres, at the end of the contract. Most of the population of Virginia during its first decade were indentured servants, making up 90% of the population. Getting freedom and land at the end of a contract sounds like a nice promise, but mortality rates continue to be high, as much as 30% per year in the swampy grounds of the Jamestown area. This all changed in 1619 when the servants slowly switched over from indentured Europeans to enslaved Africans, when, just by happenstance, so it seems, slaves were traded into the port at Jamestown. John Rolfe writes about it in his journal. About the latter end of August, a Dutch man-of-war of the burden of 160 tons arrived. He brought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes, which the governor bought food and supplies at the best and easiest rates they could. So African slavery in North America starts with 20 or so Africans arriving by accident, basically, in 1619, and of course ends with close to 4 million held in bondage by 1865 in North America. These 20 had been taken from Angola in West Central Africa. At first, why would these servants be any different than their European counterparts? And for most part in the early 1600s, they weren't. It was only in the late 17th century when African slavery became codified in Virginia's legislature, the House of Burgesses, and became an institution distinguishing itself from white indentured slavery based on race and generational. In one instance, in 1640, a black indentured servant named John Punch tried to escape along with 2 other white indentures from a Virginia tobacco plantation. All 3 were caught in Maryland, sent back to Virginia, and given a trial before the governor's council. The 2 white escapees had 4 years added to their servitude, while Punch's sentence extended his slavery for the duration of his life, setting the stage for slavery to be different for blacks and whites in the colonies. Before the mid-1600s, slavery was not at all based on skin color. Indeed, even some blacks, like Anthony Johnson in Virginia, owned slaves, and in the case of Johnson, 250 acres of land by 1650. Johnson once was a slave, but eventually earned his way out of bondage, purchased his own land, got married, and even had the freedom to sell his own land and move. He leased the land while he lived in Maryland, but then eventually died in 1670, 5 years after the move. The land was left to his wife to lease out, but in a court case which showed the way the culture of seeing people based on skin color started to play out, the land was taken from her. The Maryland court ruled that the said Anthony Johnson, lately deceased in his lifetime, was seized of 50 acres of land now in the possession of Richard Johnson in the county of Accomack, aforesaid, and further that the said Anthony Johnson was a Negro, and by consequence an alien. And basically, for that reason, he has no rights. A Negro, and by consequence, an alien. An alien, something separate, something different. Someone without rights, not part of what was going on there, not part of society. And that is how slavery goes from being just part of a culture of the world at the time, really, used by those who can afford it, but not binding specific people to it over time, to something more of an institution that becomes ingrained not only in this legal document and in the courts of the area, but becomes part of the expectations of culture of the entire region and union of states. This would get much worse before it gets better. In 1700, slaves made up 10% of the Tidewater region of Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. By the eve of the American Revolution, slaves made up 40%. This area, which became home to some of America's richest founders, was built on the backs of enslaved people, first European and eventually African. This horrible institution, which became so ingrained in the culture of parts of the British colonies, did not start with a slave society in mind, but it is clear that the idea of race evolved at this crucial point in Virginia and molded the future of America.